Hey guys, so today we're talking about Bezalel and Oholiab. You might be thinking, who in the world is Bezalel and Oholiab? Well, cannot wait to share the story with you guys. So before we get into it, I want to give you a little bit of context of where they are in the Bible, lead you up to their story in the Bible, and then we're going to talk about kind of what we know about them that we can read from the Bible. We're going to talk about some of their key attributes, key characteristics, but then we're also going to talk about just a little bit of their lasting legacy or some lessons that we can pull away from their lives. So I just to kind of kick off, like these guys, when I first discovered these two guys in the Bible, I really needed the encouragement, and God just used their story just to inspire me in the season of life that I am in currently, but also throughout my life as I've just been growing in my walk and growing in kind of what God wants me to do. So I hope their story also inspires and encourages you and just gives you hope for the future. So to give you context of Bezalel and Oholiab, we first meet them in the book of Exodus. So leading up to Exodus, let's do a little quick recap of what Genesis is all about and what got us to this point in Exodus. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, what happens? God creates the heaven and the earth and everything in it. In 7 24-hour time periods, God creates everything, including man, who we know as Adam. With Adam, he also made Eve. So these two people, Adam and Eve, they're beautiful, perfect. They had an intimate relationship with the Lord. God literally came and would walk with them in the Garden of Eden. The only two people on the earth. That's what the Bible sets up. Okay, so the only thing that they could not do, all right, they had access to everything in the garden except for one tree and the fruit from that one tree. But what happened? If you remember the story, Genesis 3, Satan in the form of a serpent kind of manipulates and tricks them into eating that one fruit. Boom, there is sin now in the world, and now Adam and Eve are separated from God, no longer can walk freely with the Lord in the garden, but because of that sin, God has to banish them from the garden, and now they have to deal with the consequences of their actions. So sin has entered the world, along with sin, death, shame, sickness, all that mess. But as they leave, God makes a promise to Adam. He says, Adam, one of your descendants is going to crush Satan, is going to destroy sin and make it possible for man to have a relationship with me once again. So in Genesis chapter 5, we follow kind of the genealogy of Adam, from Adam all the way to Noah, with this promise extending all the way through each one of these men. We get to Noah. All right, the world, Adam and Eve have been fruitful, they've multiplied, the people have spread around. However, not everyone believes in God. In fact, the whole world has, at this point, become depraved and evil and wicked, and only Noah is considered to be holy and righteous. So what does God do? He chooses to hit the reset button on humanity, on people. And so he gets Noah and he tells Noah to build a boat. It takes Noah approximately 100 years to build a boat, but it's big enough to hold Noah and his family, as well as 2 of every kind of animal on what we call the ark. So it starts to rain, and God wipes the earth clean. Okay, it's a catastrophic event. Water from the sky, first time it's ever rained. Water from the deeps bursting up. It's moving tectonic plates. It reshapes the earth into kind of more of what we know what the earth look like today. So as a result of that, Noah and his family, they land after the water recedes. Their boat lands. They open up the doors. Animals scatter. They're fruitful and they multiply. God looks at Noah and his family and says, I want y'all to do the same. Be fruitful and multiply and spread across the earth. However, Noah and his family, they do not spread across the earth. They're fruitful and they multiply. But after a couple generations, we see that they all kind of huddle up together. And they have this notion that if they build a great structure that reaches to the heavens, then they'll be able to commune and interact with God because of how much work they put forth in building the structure. So what does God do? He says, nope, and he hits the reset button again, and this time he confuses their languages. So they're no longer able to communicate with each other, all right? But they're confused because the languages are different. So what happens? They scatter from that point. There's those that were the descendants of Japheth, one of Noah's sons, kind of go up towards Europe. Those who are the sons of Shem, which is one of Noah's sons, kind of stay in the Middle East and go towards Asia. And then Ham is also one of Noah's sons, is kind of migrates down towards Africa. So they spread out in those continents as a result of what we know as the Tower of Babel. Fast forward a couple more generations, and now we are introduced to Abram, who is a descendant of Shem, who's a descendant of Noah, who's a descendant of Adam, right? So we have this idea of a covenant that God made to Adam, that there was going to be a descendant that was going to destroy sin and reconcile man. Well, that covenant is also being renewed in Abram. Okay, God is saying, Abram, through you, I am going to bless all nations through one of your descendants. He also promises him a promised land, which is Canaan. He also promises that he's going to make him into a massive nation. However, Abram is like 70-something years old, and he has no children. Okay, him and his wife, Sarai, at this time, have been unable to conceive and bear a child. It's shameful for them because they have no descendants. So God, he sees Abram, and he recognizes Abram's faith in him. So God says, Abram, I want you to pack up your family and all your belongings. And Abram was a relatively wealthy man. So Abram packed up all his stuff, and he moved west following God, and God showed him the promised land of Canaan, right? And then after kind of just following the Lord, God changes his name to Abraham, then changes Sarai's name to Sarah, and then lo and behold, miraculously, Sarai, at an old age, I think she's like 75 or something, becomes pregnant. And at the age of 100, Abram finally sees his firstborn son through the promise of what God made to him. So Isaac is born. And this is cool. So from the covenant God made to Abraham now passes on to Isaac. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. That covenant passes on to Jacob. And then Jacob has 12 sons. So at this point, we're not going to look at all 12 of his sons, but I just want to highlight Joseph for a second. Because Joseph, when he was a child, he had a dream that God put him in a position of authority over all of his brothers. So his brothers didn't like that, and so they sold him into slavery. So as a slave, he was taken down to Egypt, to where he was sold into a house. He was like a house slave, at which point he was also wrongly accused and was put in prison, at which point, through miraculous events, Pharaoh heard about him and about his unique ability to interpret dreams. And his interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, through God providing for him, landed him as the right-hand man in the entire nation of Egypt. What was a divine appointment, because they were getting ready to enter into a season of famine. But through Joseph's leadership and through God just blessing him with wisdom, he was able to provide for them through that famine. And this is where it's like, is divine that his brothers, Joseph's brothers, sold him into slavery, because due to the famine, Jacob and Joseph's brothers were able to come down into Egypt, reunite with their brother, and live there through the famine. Okay. However, they did not go back to Canaan after the famine. They stayed there, and God blessed them. The Israelites grew, and they multiplied, and they became a growing nation. However, they were still in Egypt. So a couple hundred years later, there was a new Pharaoh that popped up that didn't know who Joseph was, and they didn't recognize kind of the protection that was over the Israelites. So what did they do? They submitted them to forced labor as slaves. They were extremely harsh. They were oppressive. They were mistreating the Israelites. And so after a couple generations of being in slavery, the Israelites cried out to God for saving. God heard their prayer. And this is when we're introduced to a person named Moses. Moses had a very unique upbringing. He was a Hebrew child who barely escaped being killed by Pharaoh's decree to kill all the male children. So Moses was saved. And he was saved by Pharaoh's daughter, who actually raised him as her own. So here's a Hebrew boy raised in the household of Pharaoh. Okay, when he's about 40 years old, he killed a man, and then out of fear of being executed, he ran away and lived in the wilderness for like another 40 years. And then God called him to come back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and demand that Pharaoh let the Israelites go out of slavery. So Moses did that. At first, Pharaoh's like, absolutely not. What does God do? God then shows off through these amazing plagues that he sends upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, devastating plagues, to where finally Pharaoh says, fine, go, get out of here. However, he changes his mind and then grabs his army and starts chasing the Israelites to the edge of the Red Sea, where the Israelites are in panic and like despair. We're gonna die. What does God do again? God parts the Red Sea, and so the Israelites can walk through the Red Sea. And Pharaoh says, "Oh, that looks cool. I'm gonna do the same thing." And he starts following after them, but God says, "Nope," and He covers them over in the Red Sea, and they all go swimming and probably drown. So this is where we are. The Israelites are in this wilderness on the other side of the Red Sea. They've just been delivered from slavery. They're a new, fresh, budding nation with no governing structure. All they have is Moses, okay, and then the little tribal leaders that they have. So God leads them to Mount Sinai, where he invites Moses up to come and communicate with him. And he gives Moses the law, which is a law about holy living, about being holy, and about worship. Okay, but then he also gives Moses instructions for building a tabernacle, which is the tent of meeting, which he's going to use as kind of the center point of worship in the Israel nation. So this is where we learn for the first time about two men, Bezalel and Oholiab. Okay, so just to give you like a quick context of Bezalel and Oholiab's lives. So remember that they grew up as slaves in Egypt. Okay, they were born into slavery. They were probably beaten. They were probably had terrible living conditions. Like it's literally Africa, so it's hot. It's hard, difficult work. They were doing forced labor. It was just a difficult life. However, what we're getting ready to see, and what we're getting ready to notice about them, is that they had the choice to become victims of the situation that they were in, but they didn't. They instead took advantage of the opportunities that they had to learn, to grow, to invest in their abilities. Not only were they just like skilled labor, forced labor slaves, but they became skillful in what they did. They honed their skills as slaves. Okay? So this is what I think is really cool when we start getting into Bezalel and Oholiab. So when God finished giving the instructions of the tabernacle and the instructions of all of the furnishings that were going to take place in the tabernacle, he looked at Moses. Well, he didn't look at Moses. He said to Moses, he said, "Listen, I have specifically appointed two men to oversee this project. One, Bezalel. I want you to use Bezalel because I have filled him with the Spirit of God." So God's Spirit was filling Bezalel. Okay, God had given him great wisdom and ability and expertise in his field. Okay. I just think this is cool. Think about this for a second. Okay, God, the creator of the universe, he made everything. Boom, snapped his fingers. Okay, everything with his words, he created everything that there is. He's recognizing the skill and the expertise of Bezalel. The creator of the world recognizes that Bezalel is good at creating things with his hands. Just think about that for a second. God was not blind to the years of suffering that Bezalel went through. Instead, God saw how Bezalel invested in himself and increased his skill and ability as a slave. God recognized that, and now God is saying, I want to use that in him. We'll get back to this later, but I think this is really neat. Okay, but then also, God appointed Oholiab to be his assistant. So these two men, Bezalel and Oholiab, God specifically named them by name and said, I want these two men to oversee the building of the tabernacle, whether they're doing the work themselves or whether they're organizing and training and just setting up the people to build the tabernacle. So they were in charge of building it. And then they did a great job doing it because they did it. And as you read through Exodus chapter 31 through Exodus 40, you kind of see everything that they did. Moses was very good about writing down who did what and how they did it. And it's neat just to see how they went from this idea of what God laid out to actually seeing it fulfilled just a few chapters later. So there were, as we read about Bezalel and Oholiab, there were three things that really jumped out to me, characteristic-wise. That's what I highlight. The first one is that they were both filled with the Spirit of God, who gave them great wisdom, ability, and expertise. Bezalel and Oholiab were wholly dependent on what God gave them. We can work hard and we can strive, but the difference between Oholiab and then just your typical plumber or your typical carpenter is that they were wholly and utterly dependent on the Lord. Everything they did was dependent on the Spirit of God that was in them. God, and think about this, think about who's the active person in this. Who's the one doing the giving? God gave the Spirit of himself. God gave the Spirit to Bezalel and Oholiab. With that Spirit came the wisdom that they needed to build, and the wisdom they needed to oversee this project. It gave them the ability to actually do the work, and it gave them the expertise to make sure it was excellent, right? So God is the one who gave Bezalel and Oholiab everything that they needed. Also, the second characteristic is that Bezalel and Oholiab were considered master craftsmen. Okay, I looked it up, and Malcolm Gladwell, in today's world, Malcolm Gladwell has kind of coined this idea that it takes approximately 10,000 hours in a trade or in a skill to become a master at it. So 10,000 hours broken down into 40-hour work weeks is a little less than 5 years. Okay, so the Bible doesn't really say how old Oholiab and Bezalel were. Okay, I think it's safe to assume that they were probably over 60 years old, just because of the respect and just the renown that they had in a nation of like over 1 million something people. So they were master craftsmen. They invested the time into their skills to become masters at it, right? That's the next thing that we hear about them. And then the third thing, and this is mentioned specifically by Moses in chapter 35 of Exodus, it says that they were willing to invest in others. They were willing to teach others what they had learned. So not only had Bezalel and Oholiab invested all this time, not only were they wholly dependent on the Lord, but they were very intentional about finding men and women that were younger than them, that were less skilled than them, and they took the time to train and invest in them and to help them grow and become masters themselves. You see, Bezalel and Oholiab probably could have built the tabernacle all by themselves, but it would have taken them forever because it was a large undertaking for them. What did they do? They recruited other people to help them out. They led a group of others who wanted to be a part of building this tabernacle, and they took the time to invest in them. They hit the pause button on their busy schedule, their busy lifestyle, in order to help others grow in their skill. And I'm sure they're probably talking about the Spirit of the Lord too. They're probably talking about how this is going to be for the Lord. This is something that we're doing for God. Like, think of the discipleship that was happening as they were also teaching these people how to join logs together, or how to stitch embroidery into fabric. Like, these are the things that they were teaching them. Very hands-on technical things, but they were also having the opportunities to invest the wisdom that God had given them, right? So they were filled with the Spirit, they were master craftsmen, and they were willing to invest in others. So what can we take away from this? What is their legacy? So first off, their legacy, I want you to just ponder this for a second. When we get to chapter 40 in Exodus, we see this scene to where the Spirit, the presence of God, fills the tabernacle. Okay? So in just 9 chapters, from our perspective, 9 chapters after God calls Bezalel and Oholiab by name, he is filling the temple that Bezalel and Oholiab were responsible for building. Okay? Just imagine, just be creative here for a second. Put yourself in the shoes of Bezalel and Oholiab. Okay, you have spent, whether it's been weeks or months or maybe more than a year, I don't know how long it took them to build it. I'm sure that's written down somewhere. But imagine, like, after this project is done, everything is finished, you're complete, you and your assistant Oholiab are standing off to the side, and then you see this miraculous, amazing moment to where the presence of God descends down in this thick cloud, and it enters into the tabernacle and it fills it. I kind of have this imagine, like if you ever go camping in a tent, like the tent's typically like, way down. Well, imagine like the Spirit of God going in, and then all of a sudden you see the sides of the tent just kind of bulge out. That's kind of what I'm imagining, because it said the smoke was so thick, the cloud was so thick that Moses was not able to enter it. And Moses was the one who had been the most intimate with the Lord, who was the most, if anyone could have entered it, it would have been Moses. So I see that, like, just what they did was used by the Lord. What they built was used by God. And not only was it that, but it was also the center of worship for the nation of Israel for approximately 400 years until King Solomon built the temple, and they moved from the tabernacle into the temple. And then also thinking about this is cool, just cool thought is that God did not waste their years as slaves. Yes, it was terrible. Yes, it was awful. They were oppressed. They were persecuted. They were probably beaten. They probably had terrible living situations, But God did not waste it. He saw that they invested their time. He saw that they were disciplined in their trades. They pushed themselves to excellence. He saw that, and he ended up using that, and he honored that. He honored their humility in learning their skill. He honored their perseverance in becoming masters at something, and they were able to use it for his honor, use it for his glory, and use it so that others could worship him for hundreds of years to come. And I just think that's amazing. That gives me hope and inspiration for whatever discipline I go through, whatever seasons of training or of like working in the shadows of right now. I get hope and encouragement from it because I know that the time I spend investing now in my personal development, God sees it and he recognizes it, and I trust that he's going to use that later down the road. What else?